I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's lecture, which is sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics and Institutions. The Washington Forum is now in its third year of business, and we're pleased to be able to bring to Ohio University speakers with views not always given a wide hearing at this or other university campuses. That we can offer a forum like this is thanks to the generous donations from Ohio University alumni and from private foundations, not, I should note, from sticking our snouts in and feeding at the public trough. Tonight's lecture in particular is made possible by a generous grant from the Charles Koch Foundation, which has been a generous benefactor of our efforts for the last few years. And I also need to thank Brian Shane from the History Department for his enormous help in making this event possible. Our speaker tonight is Amanda Foreman, who comes to us from New York. Born in London, brought up in Los Angeles, and educated in England, she did her undergraduate work at Sarah Lawrence in Columbia before taking her DPhil in 18th century British history at the University of Oxford in 1998. Her first book, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, appeared in the same year as her doctoral thesis on the same subject. It was the #1 bestseller in England, made it on the bestseller list here in the United States, and won the prestigious Whitbread Prize for Best Biography in 1999. As if that weren't enough, her first book inspired a television documentary, a radio play starring Dame Judi Dench, and a movie starring Keira Knightley and Ralph Fiennes. And I learned on the drive down today that we all want a television movie starring Keira Knightley and Ralph Fiennes, because apparently in the month after that's appearance, Georgiana sold 250,000 copies. So we all need to work on that. In addition to writing and reviewing for newspapers and magazines, Foreman's currently a judge for the David Dan Prize, the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize, and the Man Booker Prize. And apparently she just told me that the David Dan Prize is $1 million prize, and so if any of you have a book, you should talk to her afterwards. While researching Georgiana at Chatsworth House, she chanced upon some letters which led her to her next project, about which she'll talk this evening. A World on Fire, Britain's Crucial Role in the American Civil War, tells the story of our Civil War as it was seen and understood by Britons, nearly 50,000 of whom participated in the war. To pull off this project required thinking about common problems in uncommon ways. As she herself puts it, as cousins by culture and yet strangers by nature, the Britons at the center of her story are unrivaled historical witnesses. Moreover, their perspective as both the parent and rival of American civilization, their experiences of immigration and integration, their understanding of the outsider's struggle, makes them a talisman for the present. There's never been a book about this bloody pas de deux between these closest of strangers. And the reason a book like A World on Fire has never been written has everything to do with the enormous amount of work required to research it. Indeed, to read through her list of archival collections upon which the book is founded is to be at once impressed and humbled by the unmistakable evidence of her Herculean efforts. And finally, to keep the mass of material clear in one's head and to weave it into a seamless narrative takes not just the beautiful, lucid, and evocative prose for which she's noted, but a sense of balance, proportion, and synthesis, which is rare indeed. The book is already winning prizes. It's been nominated for the Lionel Gelber Prize in Canada, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and it has recently won the Fletcher Pratt Award for the Civil War for the best book on the American Civil War. I hope you'll join with me tonight in welcoming Amanda Foreman here to Ohio University.
Well, thank you very much for having me here in Athens. I had lunch at Salam Cafe. I hope you all know it. It was completely delicious. And then tried Zoe's for dinner, also completely delicious. So thank you very much, both those restaurants. I noticed that throughout my day here, I've been asked several times, how is it that I could move from writing a book about an 18th century Duchess to writing a book about the Civil War? Somebody actually even said to me, you know, they're so different. If you don't mind my saying, aren't you a tourist in one of these subjects? And judging by your accent, it sounds like you're a tourist in the American subject. So what I want to do, just to begin with is I'd like to outline to you why these two books, A World on Fire and The Duchess of Devonshire, are really actually connected within one intellectual endeavor. Because it all began when I was at Sarah Lawrence in New York City, where I was an undergraduate. And when I was there, this was it was the 90s. And it was just when there was this whole wave, what we now call, the PC revolution, whatever, political correctness. And it really hit Sarah Lawrence hard. We had a sit-in that lasted for 2 months. And of course, in many ways, that was great fun. I mean, no classes for 2 months with the perfect excuse that we were having a sit-in. And there was lots of chanting, placards, marching around, and some of the demands were perfectly reasonable. The cafeteria was terrible, for example, and really needed improving. And and sometimes the arguments got very heated. But the interesting thing is that just underneath all the hot air and the rhetoric and the chest beating and hair pulling was actually something incredibly sincere, genuinely sincere, and very real. And it was that these students felt that they were being introduced to the first time to historical guilt. And they felt genuine anguish about this. They felt that they were guilty of something. And sometimes it was framed around the arguments about diversity, that they wanted more diversity. Coming from an English boarding school, I was absolutely fascinated by this. This diversity thing, what is it? But once you looked into these arguments, it wasn't really only about diversity, or even actually about diversity. It was a sense of disappointment that what they had read about in history, the promises of the Civil War, the promises of the civil rights eras, that these hadn't come to fruition at Sarah Lawrence in the 1990s. And there was this genuine pain that the struggles, the expectations had not been met, and hadn't come to what they felt, hadn't reached the paths that they felt should have been reached. Anyway, so we all graduated eventually, and everyone went on to do their own thing and become gainfully employed. And to be honest, that for me remained the exclamation mark, and has been the exclamation mark for the rest of my intellectual life. And when I went to Oxford, I went in order to study the teleology of that great, passionate volcano that I had witnessed at Sarah Lawrence. And so I did a master's on the abolition of the slave trade. And then I went on to begin a PhD on attitudes to race and color in 18th century Britain. And it was while I was researching the life of the politician who had proposed the motion to abolish the slave trade in Britain in 1806. I was looking at his life, and I discovered these extraordinary letters between him and his mistress, and his mistress's mistress, who she was sharing with her husband. But I realized I'd come across something rather extraordinary, and to be honest, just that much more interesting than what I had been reading previously. And so that became the nexus of the life of the Duchess of Devonshire. But while I was researching her life, I was given access by the then current Duke of Devonshire to turn over every single box at Chatsworth. And I took him at his word and spent 2 months in the basement just going through all the papers of the various dukes. And got through the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th Duke. But it was the 8th Duke of Devonshire that had this bombshell revelation. Because it turns out This is my Duchess of Devonshire's great nephew, the 8th Duke. It turns out that he had had this intimate connection with the Civil War. And it had all started because of a woman called Skittles. And Skittles was very famous for two things, and they weren't completely unconnected. The first was that she drove this perfectly matched pair of horses, absolutely identical. And the second was that she was incredibly expensive to maintain. And her lover, who was then the Marquis of Hartington, he hadn't yet become the Duke of Devonshire, and he was the richest bachelor in Britain at the time, even he couldn't keep up. And instead of, as it were, manning up to the situation and saying to her, my dear, why don't we sell one of the horses or both of the horses? He just, without telling anyone, booked a one-way passage to New York and skipped town. And when he arrived in New York, he went to stay at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which in those days was the most modern hotel in the world. And what he particularly liked and was really impressed by was something that he called was a vertical railway that took him from the ground floor up to his room on the fifth. It was amazing. He loved that. And he also was very impressed by this pipe contraption so that when he called down and asked for hot tea, it was brought to him 5 minutes later, still hot. Something that never happened in England. And so he used room service frequently. And this meant that after about 3 weeks, when he had an unexpected knock on the door at about 10 at night, he wasn't at all worried. He thought this was some preternatural way of them now guessing that he wanted hot tea, And so he opened the door, and it was Skittles. It was amazing. She had found him. She tracked him down across the Atlantic at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. So obviously he was delighted to see her, absolutely delighted, and said to her that they should be together, they must be together. It was wonderful that she'd come over, and she should go back to her lodgings, and in the morning come over with her bags, and they would be together. So she, overjoyed, went back to her lodgings and waited until morning, and in the meantime, he went to the station and bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. And when he arrived, he checked into Willard's Hotel, which then was the focus of political power in Washington, D.C. It was where politics and lobbying and everything all coalesced. And there were things he liked about Willard's. He liked the cocktails very much. This was really cocktail center in America, and he learned to drink the hard stuff here. No more brandy and water, What he didn't like was that southern custom of spitting gobs of tobacco stuff all over the place, door handles and floors and walls. He was revolted by that. But he liked the gossip. He was a politician himself, a liberal politician. He very much enjoyed the jousting, the toing and froing. So he became very comfortable there. He made a few friends, even met an English colonel called Colonel Leslie. And so he wasn't that concerned. At about 3 in the afternoon, when there was a knock on his door, he assumed it was his friend, Colonel Leslie. Come, said, open, and in walked Skittles. So obviously, he was delighted to see her, absolutely delighted, and he swore that there had been some kind of miscommunication about the DC thing, and he'd always expected that she would come here, and that they must dine together that very evening at 5. But obviously, she had to change for dinner, so if she would just be a dear and go to her lodgings and change for dinner, all would be well. So she ran back to her lodgings and threw on her clothes for the evening. And in the meantime, he and Colonel Leslie rented a canoe and rushed to the Potomac River and started paddling furiously to the other side, to Virginia. Because it was 1862, and he thought that, Skittles could get across the Atlantic, she could get to Washington, D.C., but could she brave the federal pickets and get across to Virginia? And so they left her weeping like Dido on the banks of the Potomac, where they got to Virginia, and then headed straight to Richmond. And here, the amazing thing is that something even more powerful than Skittles worked its magic on Hartington, the young Duke, and that was Southern charm. This man had arrived in the US completely pro-Northern, but by the time he'd spent a week in Virginia, he was completely pro-Southern. So much so that he attached himself to Robert E. Lee, hung out with him, was his bag carrier, made eggnog for the officers on Christmas Day. And when he eventually did return back to England in April 1863, he became a kind of unofficial spokesman for the Confederacy in Parliament. And since he had just been made the Under Secretary of War, this was a very powerful spokesman for the Southern cause. And yet, he had a brother, a beloved brother, called Lord Frederick Cavendish. And Lord Frederick had also gone to America the year before in 1860. He'd traveled around, he'd danced at the White House, he knew everybody. And he'd come back to England, still completely pro-Northern. And these two brothers had a massive falling out over the war. Hartington said this was a war about the right to self-determination, a right for nations and peoples to choose their own future, to become free or not. Lord Frederick Cavendish said that's absolute rubbish. This is a war for individual freedom, for the rights of man to choose how to dispose of his labor. And I thought, here we have, in the micro, the arguments that were going on in the macro here in America. You have one family, brothers, divided over the meaning of the war, even the causes of the war. And I thought, this is what I want to study next. And I want to see whether, is it just an aristocratic argument among the Cavendishes, or did it spread throughout England? And to my surprise, I realized this was a family argument in its widest sense, that the whole country, Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, and Ireland, although I still myself think of Ireland as quite separate in those days, even though it wasn't, that they were all engaged intellectually and passionately over the war. Now, we know that over 50,000 Britons volunteered to fight in the Civil War here. That's 50,000 Britons, excluding the Irish, so that would be another 200,000, who actually got on a boat and sailed over here to volunteer. Most of them fought for the North. It's easier to get to. There was a great bounty waiting for them once they volunteered. But a very sizable number, several thousand, fought for the South. And I just wanted to know, what did they think they were fighting for? And I'm pretty sure that it's not, they weren't coming over in order to keep slavery going. It seemed a very unlikely reason to get on that boat. So what I want to talk to you about today is two such British volunteers who fought for the South, to see in their histories whether there's anything that we can tease out to understand what it was that had so many Brits supporting and fighting the South. And the first volunteer is a young man called Henry Weems Fielding. Just often you may have noticed that English like to have funny names that are spelt one way and then are pronounced another, just to scare you. So his middle name is written Wemyss, but is pronounced Weems. And he came from a very aristocratic family. His father was Sir John Fielding. They had a large estate up north. Henry had a traditional English upbringing. He went to boarding school, then he joined the army. And he was in a regiment called the Black Watch, and they were sent off to help put down the Indian Mutiny, which meant that he saw at a very young age, only 20, some of the most terrible military and civilian atrocities that took place in the 19th century. Some of the most tragic, awful massacres, retributions, that kind of thing. And you would think that on someone that young, to see so much gore and bloodshed and destruction, they'd be a walking basket case. But interestingly, the effect on Henry, instead of sending him off into a twirl of post-traumatic stress disorder, was to actually make him more sympathetic and more empathetic to the underdog, to what he perceived to be oppressed peoples. One of his great friends was the poet Algernon Swinburne, and Swinburne wrote of him, "I defy you not to like Henry, if you knew him. He's one of the nicest fellows alive, and full of admiration, as such a man would be, for all fallen causes and exiled leaders and the like." So I think it was the uphill struggle of the Confederacy that appealed to Henry's sense of chivalry. And once he heard that the North had a blockade by federal ships of southern ports, and that this was impeding the South's ability to import arms and necessities, he sold his commission in the British Army and used the money to put together a cargo, a shipment of supplies, uniforms, medicines, daily necessities. And he sailed across the Atlantic with this mercy shipment, as he thought it was, and ran the blockade into Charleston, where it was then distributed, and then he went down to Richmond to volunteer. And when he arrived, the first thing he did was he wrote to his parents to say, "The city is one great camp. And I saw at once that the demand for appointment as officers is enormous, and that my chance of getting a military appointment was very small indeed. I paid a visit to the Secretary of War and presented my letters to him, and was told that a good number of Englishmen have already come out to this country, and have been told, with very rare exceptions, that they were obliged to serve as volunteers until they proved themselves fit for military appointments. I thought this would happen to me, but today I was informed by the President himself that I have been appointed Captain and Assistant Adjutant General. I'm going to Charleston, where we daily expect the whole force of the Yankee Armada to be thrown against that portion of the state." Now, before Henry left Richmond for good, he had one duty to fulfill. He had been given a box of presents by English admirers to give to General Stonewall Jackson. So he set off, and it turned out to be a terrible day. It was really wet and stormy and muddy, and by the time he arrived at Jackson's camp, he was absolutely soaked. But to his amazement, Jackson took off my wet overcoat with his own hands, and then made a fire for me whilst my boots were drying. We had a very pleasant conversation, wrote Henry, until dinner, when we were joined by the other members of his staff. And when it was time for me to leave, I found Jackson still trying to dry my coat for me. Goodness, to think, in the midst of his duties, with the cares of a vast army on his shoulders, the general found the time to carry out these little acts of thoughtfulness for me. Now, what's very important about this letter is that it's practically the only letter, and this excerpts from a much, much longer description, we have by a foreign observer of General Jackson. And it was also written 6 weeks before he was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But as for Henry himself, he then settled in Charleston, and he went to live in a house that was run for and by English blockade runners. And this cheered him up considerably. because it gave him unfettered access to breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As he confessed to his aunt back in England, "Until then, I had been eating the diet of ordinary Southerners, which is coffee made out of rye, or else water. For lunch, we had crackers and old bacon, or occasionally tough meat. For dinner, the same. My dear aunt, the people of the South are suffering very much for the want of good food." But then, shortly after he wrote this letter, the long-awaited bombardment of Charleston took place. And for those of you who know your Civil War history, this was a total fiasco. And the Federal Navy went home with its tail between its legs. This really thrilled Henry. He wrote home to say, "I don't think the Yankees can capture Charleston, do what they will. And in 6 weeks or more, the unhealthy season will come in, and then those scoundrels will die on this coast like rotten sheep." And he was so convinced that there was going to be a Confederate victory by Christmas that he converted his entire life savings into Confederate currency while it was still cheap to buy. Now, at about this time, a very famous English colonel came to town called Colonel Fremantle. And for those of you who have ever seen the film Gettysburg or read any of Michael Shara's novels, you'll know that Colonel Fremantle was this officer in the English Coldstream Guards who was traveling through the southern states during the war and kept a diary, which he published, called 3 Months in the Southern States. And it's it's an amazing document, and it's always referenced because it's so full of interesting information. Anyway, so Fremantle arrived in Charleston, and he was naturally shown around the city by Henry. And Fremantle thought this was absolutely hilarious because he'd gone to Sandhurst, Britain's military college, with Henry's older brother. So here is the younger Fielden showing him around wearing his grey uniform and talking ever so earnestly about things. And Fremantle noticed that Henry was particularly earnest about Southern women. So much so that actually Fremantle recorded one of their conversations. Henry said, "The more I see of the Southern ladies, and the more I hear of their actions, of their grand heroism, of their sacrifices, of their sufferings, the more I am lost in astonishment. Words cannot express my admiration of them." So, as you can imagine, it was only a matter of time before one lady in particular captured his full admiration. And this was Miss Julia McCord. She had a very sort of interesting background. She herself was very beautiful. That wasn't so surprising. Her own father, who was a late congressman, was known as Handsome Davy McCord. So clearly the apple hadn't fallen very far from the tree. And she had recently, though, fallen on hard times. And she'd come to Charleston to get a military pass to see her brother. And fate had taken her to Henry's office. And obviously sparks had flown between the two of them because she kept that military pass among her papers for the rest of her life. And they very shortly began to write to each other. And you can see in these very touching letters that they become increasingly blind to everything that's going on around them. Henry sort of notices in passing that when his fellow officers get sick or go on leave, there's no one to take their place. It just the army is shrinking around his ears, and he doesn't seem to notice. But of course we notice, and the South noticed, the authorities noticed, and they were increasingly relying on partisan rangers or raiders or privateers, basically anybody to fill in the gaps. And one of our other British volunteers followed that route into the war. And his name is Bennett G. Burleigh, and he came from Scotland. And Burleigh, he sort of came from what we would call, the sort of upper middle classes. His father owned several iron factories. He was called Robert Burleigh. But the thing about Robert Burley was that he didn't want to be a factory owner. That wasn't what his life was about. His father had been a factory owner, and his father's father had owned this bloody factory. And he wanted to be an inventor. That was what his life was about. So he'd spent most of his adult life inventing things that no one wanted. And he finally thought he'd hit pay dirt by inventing a plan for what he called an underwater torpedo, what actually we today would call a limpet mine. That's sort of how it worked. And he tried to get London interested in developing this plan and couldn't get any takers. So he gave the blueprints to his son, Bennett, and told him to go to the south. He thought, they were small, struggling, just maybe they'd be more receptive to new ideas. So he told Bennett, take the plans and sell them to Richmond. So Bennett sailed across the Atlantic, he ran the blockade, he got to Richmond, he showed the plans to anyone who was willing to listen, and finally someone did, and he was thrown into prison as a spy. But the amazing thing is that even here, in the depths of Castle Thunder, Southern charm worked its magic. Within 2 weeks, Bennett was so thoroughly converted to the Southern cause that not only did he offer to build this prototype of this torpedo for free, he offered to go on the mission, man it himself, and join the Confederate Army. So the authorities said, fine, knock yourself out. And they let him out of prison, he put it together, he went off on a mission, and it was during the execution of this mission that he discovered one fatal flaw in his father's designs, which was that the torpedo wouldn't explode. So this ended his career as an arms entrepreneur, but he had still volunteered to fight. The authorities weren't that keen on having him by this point, so they made him an acting master in the Confederate Navy. And since the Navy had no ships to speak of, they didn't feel that he could do much damage there. But it was about this time that he met a young man named John Yates Bell. Although it's written Beale, it's pronounced Bells. I guess the Southerners have their ways too. And John Yates Bell he'd recently been invalided out of his Virginia regiment, but he still wanted to fight. He still had plenty of pluck in him. And he'd come up with this idea of setting up raiding parties on the Chesapeake Bay in order to interrupt the federal supply lines. And he went with this idea to the Secretary of Navy, Confederate Secretary of Navy, Stephen Mallory, and Mallory said to him, look, I'm not against the idea, but I have no men and no ships to spare. So you can do it, but you can't have any volunteers who are liable to conscription, which is young men aged between 19 and 42, Southern citizens. And if you do find anyone, you'll have to pay them yourself, and they'll have to equip themselves and out of whatever you can cobble together. So miraculously, Bell still managed to find 19 volunteers, of which Bennett G. Burley was one. And off they went on their raiding parties, and actually, they did extremely well. And they did so well that in November 1863, Washington sent down a joint military and naval expedition which smashed the raiding party and captured 19 of the raiders. One escaped. And that one was our friend Bennett G. Burley. And he got to Richmond, and actually he was rather shaken up by the whole experience. He didn't feel like going back into raiding or anything anytime soon. He wanted a break. So he joined the Southern Illustrated News as a journalist. And he liked that. He was very good at that. And it worked very well until the paper ran out of ink. And then he was out of a job. Then he heard that down the road, the New Richmond Theatre was auditioning for parts in a play called The Gorillas. And since he'd just been one, he thought that he'd do very well at it. And they thought so too. So he acted in The Gorillas for a while, but then, all things come to an end, the play closed, and he was out of a job. So he went back to raiding. He hooked up with Fitzhugh Lee, carried on a couple of missions, and then was captured while cutting federal telegraph wires and sent to Fort Delaware, where he was told that he was going to spend the rest of the war in this fort. Now, while Bennett was ruefully, shall we say, contemplating his lot, thinking that he had just played his last hand in the war, Henry and Julia were celebrating theirs because they had become engaged. Henry wrote to her to say, "You will trust me, dearest, won't you, to love you ever as I do now. Whatever happens, if I am alive, you will be protected, darling, by someone who will think of nothing else for the rest of his life but of making you happy." And he closed that particular letter with a request that she forgive him if he didn't write to her every day, twice a day, because the mail in Charleston was being interrupted by continuous bombardment, which was true. And the general in charge by this point was a man called General Jones. And General Jones's remedy for stopping the federal bombardment was to move the high-ranking Confederate prisoners in Upper Charleston down to Lower Charleston directly in the line of fire as human shields. And this was very shocking to Henry. He'd seen a lot of things in his life, and one of the reasons he had admired the Confederacy so much was that he thought that it had adhered to a special code of chivalric warfare, and using federal officers as human shields contravened that code. So he sent a letter of protest to the authorities. And when that was ignored, he then put on his best uniform and went down to the prison to check on the prisoners to see whether they were actually being blown to smithereens or not. And he had a long chat with General Seymour from New York. And this is what Henry said afterwards. "My dear Julia, I had hardly ever met a Yankee before, and certainly never a Yankee general before this. And I had thought that the contact would make one's flesh crawl. But strange to say, I could not blow General Seymour from a gun or hang him without a good deal of repugnance. Indeed, after our conversation, I felt more inclined to ask him to dinner and show him around Charleston." Because of this and Henry's protest, what he discovered was that every time his commanding officer put his name forward for promotion, the authorities in Richmond turned it down, and he stayed at the lowly rank of captain for the rest of the war. But this didn't stop them from sending him out on increasingly dangerous missions. One involved going down to Florida to round up deserters. This was the kind of mission where you were more likely to get shot in the back by your own side than in the front. But he survived that, and when he got back to Charleston in early September 1864, he was shocked to discover that Atlanta had fallen. He had no idea. So he proposed to Julia that they not wait for the end of the war, that they get married right now. Because, as he explained to her, if he were to be killed now, then at least she would have a widow's pension to keep her together. By now, Henry's fortune had shrunk to 1 gold sovereign. And he gave this to a jeweler with the instruction that he turn the gold sovereign into 2 rings. And by necessity, their wedding celebration was very small indeed, just a very small party. But it wasn't a miserable affair, because just before the party began, one of his fellow officers arrived with the news that something big and important was about to take place in Canada that was going to change the whole face of the war. They didn't know what it was, but they'd been told that it was very important. Now, We know exactly what it was because it involves our friend Bennett G. Burley. Because amazingly, Bennett had discovered that the reason why his cell in particular in Fort Delaware was so particularly disgusting, so unbearable, was because the prison sewage pipe passed directly underneath his bunk. And so one very dark and stormy night, Bennett and 3 friends got together and, timing their blows with the peals of thunder, smashed open the floorboards and then smashed open the pipe. And then the 4 of them crawled through 125 yards of raw, stinking sewage in pitch black to get to the Delaware River. But this being real life and not the Shawshank Redemption, 2 of them actually drowned in that pipe, never made it out alive. And only 2 made it out alive, and only Bennett avoided capture. He was picked up by a passing fishing boat and dropped off in Philadelphia, and then somehow managed to make his way unrecognized to Canada, which, because it was British North America, was neutral territory, and he was free. And he was walking down the street in Toronto, where he just, by sheer chance, bumped into John Yates Bell, who had also managed to escape to Canada. And Bell had been concocting this scheme, and he was delighted, in a real sense, delighted to see Bennett, because he needed a second in command. So he roped Bennett into this scheme, which was this. As you all know, since you're in Ohio, in Lake Erie is an island called Johnson's Island. And on Johnson's Island then was a prisoner of war camp, and it held 3,000 Confederate prisoners of war, all officers. And so Bell's plan was, in a way, very simple. They were going to liberate these Confederate officers and bring them back to the South. And Lake Erie was actually guarded, the whole of Lake Erie, just by 1 U.S. gunboat. That was it, USS Michigan. And it wasn't even that big. It was 9 guns. It was nothing. And so Bennett reasoned that if you had 2 teams, you could use 1 team that would disable the USS Michigan, and then another team to hijack a big ferry, and then you could just take the prisoners off the island and ferry them away. So Bell and Bennett were going to hijack the ferry. And the other side of the mission was given to a man called Lieutenant Cole. And Cole was very good at a few things. He was very good at talking. He was very, very good at drinking. He was quite good at lying. And he was very bad at fighting. So his plan for disabling the Michigan was to offer the captain a very large bribe, which resulted in Cole being arrested and the whole mission being exposed, so that when Bennett and Bell and their little crew arrived on their hijacked ferry boat, they discovered the USS Michigan was ready and waiting for them, with 20 Marines pointing their guns at them, and the Confederates nowhere to be seen. So they abandoned the mission, and they all tried to run away, and Bennett was captured. He was extradited to Detroit, where this time he was told he wasn't going to go to prison. He was going to be tried for the crime of piracy, which in those days was a capital crime, which would mean his execution. So of course he was worried, but he wasn't actually completely worried, because it was February 1865. In fact, it was the beginning of March 65. And, it was obvious that the war was about to end. And then he thought, bygones would be bygones. It would all be fine. They'd probably just send him home with a slap on the wrist. As you can imagine, this is not what Henry wanted. He did not want the war to end. He was very keen to keep going till the very bitter end. And when Charleston was evacuated, he went with his new commanding officer, General Hardee, And the plan was that they were going to coalesce down below Richmond to try to prevent Sherman from joining up with Grant. And during that march south, he became very close to General Hardee, and became very close to General Hardee's 16-year-old son, who had just arrived from school. And at the final battle of the war, the final large-scale battle, which was the Battle of Bentonville on the 19th of March, Hardee's son begged his father to be allowed to take part. And Hardee had been recently racked with dysentery. He wasn't a well man. He didn't really have the strength to say no to his son. So he asked Henry to please look after the boy. Henry said he would try. And they both took part in the charge of the Texas Rangers. And the boy took the first shot to the chest and was killed instantly. And the second bullet hit Henry. But amazingly, it was just a graze. He was actually fine. So as soon as he could, he wrote to Julia to let her know that he was still alive. And he wrote to say, "I love you. I love you, if possible, more and more every hour. Oh, my precious one, if only we are spared to meet again and live together, what happiness this will be. I don't care how poor we may be. Just the two of us being together will be the greatest blessing this earth can afford us." And it turned out that that attitude was very good, because they were actually very, very poor indeed. In fact, they were so poor that they lived in a disused train carriage for 18 months. And then finally, they packed it in and they went back to England, where Henry rejoined the army for a few years. Then he retired and became an Arctic explorer, and did very well on that, and found some rare animals and things. And then he retired, and he inherited a little bit of money, and they bought a house next door to Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling and Henry became the best of friends, and every weekend they'd go shooting and fishing together. And they did that for the next 20 years until Henry died in the late 19-teens. And Kipling wrote, "This ends for me a dear friendship with one of the kindest, wisest, bravest, and most lovable of English gentlemen ever born, and there is no one to take his place for me." So that's Henry for you. Now, for Bennett G. Burleigh, when we last left him, he was on trial for his life, and so the trial took place, and it was a hung jury. So they thought, the authorities thought perhaps this is because he was a bit too popular, you know, the whole piracy thing was making him glamorous. So they moved him to a smaller town called Clinton in Michigan. And but it wasn't really set up for this kind of trial. It took him a very long time to get things sorted. So Bennett just waited, and he waited, and the whole town got to know him. They all come to chat and meet this Scottish prisoner. And he got to know the jailer quite well. He got to know the jailer's daughter extremely well. And in September 65, it was Burleigh's birthday. And the jailer's daughter brought him an apple pie. And it was a very special apple pie. Because in the middle was a miniature saw. And so, in the middle of the night, very quietly, Bennett just sawed his way through the bars, and leaving his stuff behind, just quietly tiptoed out of the jail and disappeared. And they all wondered where he'd gone. Where was he? You know, they looked for him. No one heard anything from him or about him for about a year. And then the jailer, not the daughter, I'm afraid, received a letter from Bennett, postmarked Cape Town. And it said, "My dear sir, I'd be very grateful if you could please send me my books, because I am in need of them. I am now the foreign correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph." So that was Bennett G. Burleigh for you. So then the question is, briefly, why did these two perfectly charming, insane young men volunteer for the South? What do they think they were doing, and why? And I can give you three short reasons. And really, just as all roads lead to Rome, I think in this case, the majority of the roads lead back to Washington. The first is that at the very beginning of the war, the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, was convinced, as you probably know, that there were large pockets of pro-Union sentiment in the South. And he just needed to tap into that sentiment, to release it, and it would prevent the war from happening. So he needed to find some cause that united all Americans of all persuasions, the one thing that all Americans could agree on. And he thought there was no greater cause than hatred of England. And so this is what he pressed upon at the very beginning of the war. He made threats. He tried to goad the British. He said the British were planning to disrupt the Union. They wanted to do this, they wanted to do that. And of course, as we know, it didn't ignite pro-Union sentiment. But what it did do very successfully was that it turned the British government, which at the beginning of the war was pro-Northern and willing to offer all kinds of help to the North, into becoming a hostile neutral. But not only that, he turned the British press, which had been pro-Northern, into becoming hostile. And the South, which had also begun the war rather badly by threatening to blackmail Britain into recognizing Confederate independence by withholding cotton, saw an opportunity. And the South sent these propagandists to England who said, the North is fighting for empire, the South is fighting for freedom. And when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was read in England, the English, not having any idea of how American politics actually works, zeroed in on the fact that slaves in rebel states were freed, but not slaves in the border states. And Lincoln was accused of hypocrisy and of starting a deliberate race war and that this whole proclamation thing was a ploy and had nothing to do with slavery. And when supporters of the North tried to counteract this, Southern propagandists made all sorts of noises about slavery, which seemed to be convincing to the naive British. So much so that the son of William Wilberforce, this was Bishop Wilberforce, when Bishop Wilberforce asked the Confederate ambassador about the South's intentions for slavery. And, surely since Lincoln had issued his Emancipation Proclamation, the South was going to issue their Emancipation Proclamation. The Southern ambassador said, well, you just can't expect the South to have to make these sorts of decisions and acts while it's fighting for its life. But after the war, then the South will deal with slavery. Now, that word deal is a wonderful word. Means all sorts of things. For those of you who ever used to watch The Twilight Zone, if you remember, there's that very famous episode when aliens come down to this earth and they bring with them a book, and only the first line is translated, which is How to Serve Humanity. And everyone is very excited about this. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And only at the very end do they realize it's a cookbook. And so it's the same thing with this, we're going to deal with slavery. And so by saying that they were going to deal with slavery by the end, it enabled the South to portray themselves as the plucky underdog and the freedom fighters. And as soon as they called themselves the freedom fighters, then the South could do no wrong. And what you see is this movement from being on the fringes to suddenly being mainstream public opinion. And almost everyone in the theatre supported the South. Everyone in the universities, undergraduates, graduates, the dons. Most people in Fleet Street, that's most journalists, not all of them, but most novelists, including Dickens and Thackeray, supported the South. Darwin, who was a staunch abolitionist, supported the South. In fact, you were kind of a crank if you supported the North. Most people in the church supported the South because the South was fighting for freedom and slavery was going to be dealt with after the war. And it was only at the very end, when the war was over and obviously slavery was ended and Lincoln was assassinated, was there this sudden Damascene conversion. And Britain woke up to the fact that, no, really the North was right all along. And suddenly, you could not find a pro-Southern supporter throughout the country. It was a bit like Nazi Germany after the Second World War, when people visited the country and you couldn't find a single Nazi. No, my neighbor, no, none of us were Nazis. Who knows where they were? Same thing in England. No one was pro-Southern. So what does this mean for us today? Well, the first thing it means, I think, for this country is that the tragic example set by Seward during the Civil War shows that this country cannot ignore the importance of foreign diplomacy. What Seward had done was that he had substituted domestic policy for foreign diplomacy, and that did terrible things to America's reputation abroad. The second thing was that Seward, in particular, had ignored the fact that if you do not set and explain your agenda abroad, your enemies will do it for you. And the South did that extremely well. What it also shows, though, for the British, and I think this is also somewhat of a European disease, is that if a cause is given the right kind of language and allocated certain key words, in this case, the South were freedom fighters, then that side could do absolutely no wrong. Didn't matter what the South was really fighting for, what it was doing, even its terrorist activities in Canada was all forgiven because they were freedom fighters fighting against the tyranny of the imperialist North. What I walk away from, personally, is that I see a cause which is actually morally egregious, becoming morally fashionable. And today, and I ask myself when I become interested in any kind of cause, am I being moral, or am I merely being morally fashionable? Thank you very much. No questions. That's okay. Oh, wait, there's a couple.
Weren't there strong anti-slavery movements in England that were on the north side?
Oh, yes, there were. Actually, funnily enough, the biggest anti-slavery movements stayed neutral until the Emancipation Proclamation. So, for example, the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, one of the oldest ones, didn't lift a finger until the Emancipation Proclamation. And then they kicked in and started sending out agents to spy on the Confederates and their activities in England, and were very helpful to the North. And so it wasn't all one-sided. But they never gained the traction that they should have done, and I think would have done if the slavery message hadn't been muted for the first 2 years of the war. Yeah, go ahead.
You had across the side the 200,000 Irish, and I think most of them fought for the Union. What would be the difference in their attitude?
Well, okay. So the question is, what about the Irish? The Irish case is absolutely fascinating because although the majority of the Irish volunteers fought for the North. The Confederacy sent over a very strong contingent of propagandists to Ireland, in particular a man called Father John Bannon, who was the parish priest in Vicksburg until it fell. And he managed to get sermons against the North and against volunteering inserted into all Catholic parishes throughout Ireland. And there was certainly a very big movement in Ireland against volunteering. They would say, look, you can go out there to volunteer, but look what happened at Fredericksburg, the absolute decimation of the Irish Brigade, that every Irishman who goes out to the North is simply used as cannon fodder. You're not really fighting a war of valor here. You're simply being used up by a cynical North. Some of the recent scholarship shows that a lot of these Irish volunteers actually had gone out to work on railroads and construction projects. But once they turned up, they were illegally conscripted, drafted, tricked, drugged, kidnapped into the war, and then found themselves stuck. And then when they would write to the British ambassador asking for help to get out of the army, he would say, well, the thing is, it's against the law to volunteer. They would say, well, I didn't actually volunteer. I didn't want to be here in the first place. So that's, now, of course, that's not all of them, but how many actually volunteered because they wanted to end slavery in the North? That's a harder question to answer. Oh, yes, why did I not enter? Well, I didn't. The Trent Affair is just it's a whole lecture in itself. It's about the moment when Britain and America almost went to war during the Civil War. I mean, they were so close, and it involved the capture of these two Confederate diplomats and their secretaries. They were on a British mail boat, which was intercepted in the Atlantic. And these diplomats were taken off by a US naval captain and sent back to Boston. And Britain demanded their release. Now you ask yourself, why is it that? Why were they so cross? Well, to give you a modern equivalent, it would be the same as if a American Airlines plane was flying over Brazil and was intercepted by Iranian fighter jets and forced to land, and then two Iranian dissidents hauled off that plane and then allowed to go on its way. This country wouldn't stand for that today, and the Britons didn't stand for that then. So the British demanded their release, and while there was this prevarication going on, London began sending over thousands of troops, and they were within days of landing in Canada, and they already had their battle plan ready. They were going to invade Maine, and the North Atlantic Squadron was going to bombard New York and Philadelphia in preparation for an invasion of DC. So it's a very exciting moment in Anglo-American history, but just didn't quite fit in with this lecture. So it was great reading, though. Yes?
If you were to talk to the man on the street in England today, are there any resultant attitudes that have been handed down in families that is a topic that is ever talked about anymore?
Well, there's a kind of great deal of admiration for the Civil War because it was so bloody. But apart from that, and there's a sort of sneaking not even sneaking, I mean, there's a great deal of admiration for Lee and Jackson. In fact, the earliest biographers of Lee and Jackson were all British. And Sandhurst, for years, used to teach Southern military tactics to its undergraduates, its military undergraduates, as part of its education. Grant, they were less keen on for some reason. So there's that. But nowadays, the British just see the whole thing through Gone with the Wind, like everyone else,
Thank you, Dr. Foreman. I have a question about the motives of those who did fight for the North.
I'm sorry, what?
What are the motives of those soldiers from Britain who decided that they'd come and join the Union cause?
Well, the motives range from the genuine idealists who believed that they were going to come over here to either preserve democracy and or to help abolish slavery, and we have letters that show they thought this, to the genuine chancers, men who are running away to escape their wives, men who are running away to escape their pregnant girlfriends, or there was one man in particular who was the pub bore, and he used to sit in his pub in Manchester boring everyone to death. And one day he was just saying, what's going on in America and that war about slavery, I'd give them what for. And everyone said, great, we'll have a whip round and we'll pay for you to go there and do it. So he found himself on a boat, So yes, there was a broad mix of motives. Last one, yes. Oh, well, either one of you can choose. So the question is, what role did class play in all this? And what's very interesting is that the majority of cotton workers, of factory workers in Britain, the majority, there was a sizable minority who supported the South, but the majority supported the North. And one of the reasons was because as workers, they genuinely understood the value of owning the fruits of their labor. And so that, they were going to support the South over their dead body. And in some cases, that practically meant that because of the great distress that then took place in the middle of the war with the cotton famine. And yet there was never any mass call by these out-of-work, destitute cotton workers for Britain to change course and support the South. So that role, that did play a role. And then, of course, there were some members of the aristocracy that had this idea that the South was this chivalric squirearchy that hadn't been ruined by industrialization, and that they were somehow more charming than Yankees. That they thought Southern manners, Southern charm, seemed to work better on them than the North. So that played a role as well. But then, when the Brits would come to the South, they'd get a bit of a shock. There was a very famous journalist called William Howard Russell who reported on the Crimea. And he got to the South, and he said, he got to Montgomery, Alabama, and he said, it was so dire, it was so backward. He said it was like turning up in some small town in the interior of Russia. There was something kind of deeply sort of atavistic and kind of unmotivated in the South, apart from the one motivation, of course. But and that if he was to liken it to anything, he said the Southerners sort of reminded him of Sparta, that it was quite militaristic, and it existed on having helots to do their bidding. The Southerners thought of themselves as kind of the virtuous Romans, but really they were just the Spartans. So, or perhaps even Athens, but without the slaves. Well, with the slaves, but without the literature. So there was a kind of interesting, love-hate relationship there.
Well, let's give Dr. Foreman a round of applause, and thank you for coming today.
Major funding for the George Washington Forum is provided by the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, the Apgar Foundation, the Veritas Fund for Higher Education Reform, and the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. For more information, please visit us on the web at www.ohio.edu/WashingtonForum. Thank you.